great.
Well, let's get started. I think you've all interacted with or been in worship with Pastor Matt lately. Is this true? Yes? Pastor Matt Short most recently was the senior pastor at St. Luke's in Slinger.
Senior makes it sound, I was the only pastor at St. Luke in Slinger. Yeah.
Do they have an associate
They do
now?
not.
No. Okay.
Nope.
Sorry.
No.
Okay, Pastor Matt most recently was the pastor at St. Luke's Slinger
In
for
Slinger.
many years.
For 9.5, yeah.
For 9.5 years.
Yeah.
And then how many years ago did you go to the synod?
7.5
Oh
years.
my!
It's been a
that
long time. Yeah.
You're
Yep.
still there. Still
Yes.
making it.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
I tell people it is the hardest job I've ever had,
Yeah.
and also the most rewarding.
Yeah.
And actually, that's a really good introduction to what we're talking about
Okay.
today.
Yeah.
So.
And Pastor Matt, I will never get your title right at the synod office.
It's Evangelical Mission. Those are the only
That's
two
it?
words that matter.
Okay.
The
but what
assistant
is
to the
it?
bishop for Evangelical Mission.
Evangelical Mission.
Yeah.
Um,
So evangelism and mission. That's
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's here to talk to us about partnerships. St. Matthew's has been in partnership with several congregations for many years, including Cross in Milwaukee, Reformation in Milwaukee, the Sinisi congregation in Tanzania, and one of our partner congregations in El Salvador. So we have 4 official partnerships going right now. But the state of those partnerships is always something that we need to be aware of and working on and intentional about. So take it over.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much, and I'll step behind here because I'm guessing that helps a little. And I will also put this here to make sure I stay on task and just show off a bunch of things, I guess. But it's really wonderful to be with you all, and part of my hope today is that we can talk about what partnerships look like. And they're all over the map. We'll blow the lead right off the beginning here, and that is that partnerships are like friendships. There's a whole spectrum of how you live into that. And so I'm really excited to talk with you. I know that you have these 4 existing partnerships, 2 domestic, 2 international, and we'll talk about what that looks like and how it actually makes the Greater Milwaukee Synod kind of unique in a really beautiful way. So we are going to start, however, with the piece of paper that I might have handed you, and actually if you're coming in, I'm going to give you one. Here, Pastor Ann, can I just entrust you with the stack of, that way those of you who I didn't already hand one to. We're going to read these selected passages, or selected verses from the book of Ruth, the first chapter. So we're going to read it twice, and here are the questions I'm going to ask you to reflect on. We're going to start off with a discussion around this passage in front of you. And I'm going to ask you to reflect on these questions. I'll give them to you ahead of time so that you know kind of what you're listening for. I'm just going to ask, where do you find yourself stopping in this? What catches your attention? As you're hearing somebody else read it, what makes you go, oh, that's interesting? And then we're going to talk about how we define the word church. But for the passage, I just want to talk with you about what it is that catches your attention most clearly in this. I'm curious if we have 2 volunteers in the room who'd be willing to read that, and then we'll pause between the 2. Okay, so we'll have you read the first time, we'll leave a brief pause, and then the person who volunteers second is always like trying to catch my eye going, should I do it now? Just, you know, you can look at me and I'll just go, yeah, it's fine. Just give us a breath in between the 2. Pastor Ann, are you able to? We're about to read a passage. Thanks so much for coming in. We're going to read a passage from the book of Ruth. So I have 1 volunteer. Who's the second? Let's go with you in the back there. Excellent. Okay, so we're going to start with a prayer, just asking that God open up our hearts to this reading this morning. And I'll do that part. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. God, we thank you for the opportunity to be here in this room together this morning. We know that just an hour ago we were all in different places You've gathered us for this moment, and an hour from now, many of us will be in different places. Use this moment in our lives. Inspire us, speak to us, bind us together for the sake of the world. In Jesus' name. Amen. Okay.
In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and Elimelech, a man of Bethlehem in Judah, went to live in the country of Moab with his wife Naomi and 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives, Orpah and Ruth. When they had lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that Naomi was left without her 2 sons or her husband. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. Turn back, my daughters, go your way." Then they wept aloud. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law and left, but Ruth clung to her. So Naomi said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God."
Read the same verses.
Yes, yeah, thank you.
In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and Elimelech, a man of Bethlehem in Judah, went to live in the country of Moab with his wife Naomi and 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives, Orpah and Ruth. When they had lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that Naomi was left without her 2 sons or her husband. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. Turn back, my daughters, go your way." Then they wept aloud. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law and left, but Ruth clung to her. So Naomi said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God."
All right. So, a brief discussion. What was it that caught your attention in that reading? Go ahead.
Verse 12, where it says Ruth clung to her, even
Ah.
though Naomi had encouraged her to go back to her sort of root family, she chose to go with Naomi.
Yeah, and that word clung, that seems intentional, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, Ruth clung to her. Excellent, thank you. Others? Yeah.
And her faithfulness, her loyalty to Naomi, or being with her, because she'll, at the very last, I'm 16, do not press me to leave you.
Yeah.
Don't force me to leave you.
Hmm.
again, that intentionality.
The intentionality, the faithfulness.
Mhm.
I'll just repeat so that you can all hear. And don't force me to leave you. Yeah, right. A few other thoughts. Yeah, go ahead.
Verse 5, just reflecting on Naomi's bad luck.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right,
So that Naomi was left without her 2 sons or her husband.
right, right. And these days we would see that as tragic. In those days, of course, that was not only tragic, but also economically devastating.
So, I mean, bad luck is the wrong word.
Yeah, but I mean,
Yeah.
but what you're saying is true. I mean, this is devastating in her life, both emotionally, socially, economically. Right? Yeah, please.
One thing that struck me, if you go back to God speaking to Jacob and Esau,
Mm-hmm.
do not marry the women of those peoples,
Mm.
and the 2 sons married Moabite wives. And of course, Esau disobeyed God's order also and married a wife from another people.
Right, right. So there's all this mixing. And guess who shows up in the genealogy of Jesus when you read that in the beginning of Matthew? Ruth, the foreigner. So, yep. Please.
The last verse, were the Israelites already monotheistic?
Yes, uh-huh.
So Ruth recognized that there was only one God. I thought that was,
Mhm.
rather than listening to, go back to other gods.
Right. And your God, yeah. That last line, and this will be obvious over the course of the next hour. That last verse is part of the reason why I thought this would be a great way to open up our conversation about partnership. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. What a powerful statement of, I am with you, right? So, all right. I want to start with a story. So there we've got a story from deep in our faith. And as I mentioned, that Ruth shows up in the genealogy of Jesus. So that's fascinating, because you'd expect the genealogy of Jesus at the beginning of Matthew to be, by the book, but it's not. So here's the story I want to start with today. It'll send kind of the same message. This little, rather uninspiring box of a building is Golden Ridge Lutheran Church. This was the congregation I served as my first call, straight out of seminary in Fargo, North Dakota. Now, the joke part of that is that I was born and raised in Lake Havasu City, Arizona, which is the hottest part of Arizona. And then my first call got as a sense of humor, I got sent to Fargo. I never knew this building. So a brief history of Golden Ridge Lutheran Church is that they were founded in 1955. And in 1956, they scraped together, this was the poor area of Fargo, they scraped together all the money that they could to build this rather uninspiring box of a building as their church. Most of these folks lived in temporary housing. It still, when I served there, there were trailer parks nearby. Very few of the homes had basements. This was the poorer area of Fargo, but they were so proud. Founded in 55, in 56, scraped together the money to build this building, and in 1957, the tornado on which the F scale is based. Like, when you want to know what an F5 is, people say it's the 1957 Fargo tornado was an F5. The path was huge. You see the yellow part there? The path of that tornado went directly over top of that church they had just built less than a year earlier. This is what they came to find the next morning. Many people died because very few people had basements they could hide in, including one woman who was a member of the church and had 7 children. One of them was at a friend's house. The other 6 were at home, and she had run to the store. And all 6 of her children died. That was in 1957. I was their pastor in 2007 when we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Fargo tornado. And the most inspiring stories I heard were about how the very next morning they scraped the church did have a basement. You can see the top part of it right there. They scraped all the stuff out of the stairwell, and they went down into the basement And they started their worship service with, "Now think we all are God." So the reason I start with this story is we often think of the church as a building. When you say, "Where are you going this morning?" "I'm going to go to church." And it's here, this address right here, right? But those people taught me from minute one of being a pastor that the church is the people, not the building. Then they actually had a tiny stained glass window commemorated for their new building, and this is the building that I was in, that showed a tornado approaching a church, just to remind themselves that the church building is not the church. So, the reason that I bring this up is because it reminds us that the church is the people, and the word synod in Greek means on the way together. Syn podos, same road, on the road together. So that's who we are as a church. And this is what the church looks like, the Lutheran, the ELCA church looks like in southeast Wisconsin. These are the churches of the Greater Milwaukee Synod. And you can, kind of see where Menominee Falls is. You are part of that bigger cluster right towards the center, of course. But that is what we look like as the church. This quote is going to guide some of our time. So in just a minute, we'll stop looking at the screen and we're going to discuss some of this. But here's the quote I want us to have in our minds. "There are no haves and have-nots. We are all halves. Our assets are diverse. In the alchemy of collaboration, we become equal partners. Competition and the fear of scarcity often block us from seeing these ways of being with one another. In a you or me world, reciprocity and collaboration don't fit. But in a you and me world, our resources are not only enough, they are infinite." So, that little church that I just told you about, guess where they worshiped when they were building their new building? At another Lutheran church in the area, right? Yeah, of course. And that partnership with Peace Lutheran Church up the road continues to this day. Actually, Golden Ridge Lutheran has now closed, but the new Lutheran church, Neighborhood Lutheran Church they call it, that was built in the same building, now continues to have a partnership with Peace Lutheran Church. That partnership was born in relationship because they both saw that they were better together and that they were blessed by that relationship with each other. So that whole way of being, this way of seeing the church as bigger than just my building that I go to, just my pastors that I'm a part of, we would often say, in the Synod, I used to jokingly say when I first started out, I don't say this anymore, but I would often say that the Greater Milwaukee Synod is kind of like one of those non-denominational mega churches that brags about having one church but 5 locations. But we're one church with 115 locations. So there. But I think this is a really important remembrance of the fact that we are united in ways that are really on a spectrum, and that's what we're here to talk about today, is what partnership can look like and what it does look like in practical terms here in the Synod. So Pastor Ann mentioned that you have 4 partnerships, 2 domestic, Cross, and why am I blanking the other one? Reformation, and then 2 international, one in Tanzania, right, and one in El Salvador. Just a brief story there. I got to see the power of those. Well, quick, raise your hand if you have been to either of those international partnerships. Have you been to which one?
Oh,
To both. I love it. And how about you?
El Salvador.
El Salvador? Anyone else? So the thing that was really beautiful that I was really struck by, although it didn't surprise me at all, but was really, really striking, is how much showing up in El Salvador felt like a family reunion for some people, right? When we had Pastor Kim Jordan with us, who's at Church of the Resurrection in Pewaukee, and we visited Jesus es Amor, Jesus is Love, that's the name of the church, isn't that a beautiful name for a church? We visited her congregation's partner, and because they've been tending to this relationship over the years, literally the pastor from Jesus es Amor ran out and met Pastor Kim with a hug. And the people, some of those relationships have stayed over the years, and there was just, it felt like a family reunion but many, many miles apart, right? So we're going to talk today about what partnership looks like and what it, some stories I think would be really helpful from how it functions across the Synod here. So first, I am curious, when you hear the word church though, like when people talk about the word church, what do you think is the first image that either comes into your mind or other people when you're talking to them about the word church? What do people think of?
Going to the church, in the building.
Going in the building, yeah, absolutely.
Worship.
Worship, yeah.
The body of believers.
The body of believers. Yeah, the people, do you remember the thing that we used to do as kids? I love as soon as I do this, people know, right? Here is the church, here is the steeple, open the door and see all the people, right?
Shared faith.
And shared faith, right? So, as Pastor Ann and I were talking about why it would be helpful to have this conversation today, I think it's just good for you all to know that those, just like any relationship you have, it takes tending, right? And that's one of the things that Pastor Ann and I talked about. This is something, and the other piece that I think a lot of folks don't know, this is something that really makes the Greater Milwaukee Synod quite unique. One of the things that we hopefully are starting to get over a little bit is that I think for a good chunk of the latter half of the 20th century, churches leaned hard into their identity as businesses, and there was kind of a competitive nature between churches, right? Just like one McDonald's up the street from another McDonald's, while they're technically a part of the same franchise, the owners of each are trying to get customers into their place, right? And working in the Synod office, I jokingly said it's the hardest job I've ever had. That's been part of the challenge, is sometimes when we see each other as competitors rather than partners. But I do feel like one of the silver linings, if you can call it that, one of the things that has come out in a very beautiful way through the pandemic is that it forced us to start seeing each other as partners a little bit more than we had before. But in the Greater Milwaukee Synod, we have been leaning into relational partnerships for a long time. So a little bit of information that I didn't know before I started working in the Synod office was that a lot of synods across the country have had to close many of their urban congregations. So if you are a pastor who really would love to serve in an urban context, there aren't a ton of options, because our model of church is we have these pastors who are, we are educated, and so then we are paid like a middle-class salary, and so it assumes, our model of church assumes that you can get enough people in one place to give enough money to be able to afford a building, a pastor, and maybe some other staff to help too. And that simply doesn't work when the majority of your membership is dealing with day-to-day challenges with food insecurity or housing insecurity or whatever else, right? So we've actually had Episcopal priests approach us in the Greater Milwaukee Synod because we have an agreement with the Episcopal Church so that an Episcopal priest could serve one of our congregations. We've had them approach us to see if they could interview in some of our urban churches because we are one of the synods that still has vibrant urban ministry. Why? Because many, many years ago, there was a strong focus on partnerships. Now the downside is sometimes we can immediately go to the economic part of that partnership. Yes, that's an important part of what helps keep these congregations financially sustainable. However, if you were to talk to anybody who's involved in those partnerships, I see those kinds of family reunion moments happening all over the Synod. Have any of you ever been to the Outreach for Hope bike ride? Raise your hand if you've been to the Outreach for Hope bike ride. Tell me what you love about being there. I'm curious.
Personally, I volunteered, so volunteered with my siblings, and we just met so many cool people. We were at a crossing out in Dousman and just had the chance to see all different kinds of people biking through and chit-chatting, and then everyone comes together at the end, so there's a real sense of community.
Yeah. Others? Yeah.
Yeah, I would say just it gives you a reality, a sense of the Synod, because like You know, we've done a couple of rides at different places, and we're gonna do a third location this year, so just to be present in a different part of the Greater Synod and to meet people from other churches.
Right, right. Yeah. Any other thoughts you want to add on? Anybody else who was there? One of the things that I love is seeing those moments where people like run toward each other and they're like, hey, how was your mom doing? You know, those moments when you can tell that relationship leads the way. So back in the 70s or so, this synod had a really strong focus, and definitely into the 80s and 90s, on these kinds of relational partnerships. And it is something that other synods have stolen from us, borrowed from us. And there was a movement in the ELCA and in predecessor denominations before 1988 of these urban coalitions, they were called. So that's where the idea of like official partnerships comes from. Of course, you can have, you know, something where with a neighboring congregation you share pulpits, you know, you do a pulpit rotation during Lent or something. So that would kind of be the one end of the spectrum of a partnership, is we do a couple things together, right? And then the other end of the partnership would be and recognizing this is a big wide spectrum, right? There are some congregations like Unity in Brookfield, the best example I know of in our synod, where two congregations, one was in Brookfield, one was in the southern part of Menominee Falls. The one that was in the southern part of Menominee Falls was struggling a little bit, kind of on that path of decline. The one that was in Brookfield was booming and had nowhere to expand. And they actually built a concrete partnership where they started sharing pastoral staff and start leaning toward what it would look like to become a two-campus church. And now both congregations gave up their previous identity and they are Unity Lutheran Church. And there's two locations, both are strong, and they still call them by the old church names in terms of campus. So it's Unity Lutheran Church, Cross of Life Campus. Unity Lutheran Church, what's the other one?
Christ.
That is, yeah. So anyway, that's this end of the spectrum, right? Where you actually like merge and create one new thing legally. But there is a whole arc of ways that looks between those two ends of the spectrum. And one of the beautiful things in this synod is that we have a fair amount of partnerships within the synod that are somewhere here on the spectrum. They aren't mergers and consolidations technically, right? But they do share a lot and they really invest in the relationship. So here's a key example, and you all have two of these, right? Cross and Reformation. An example would be Our Saviors in Economwalk and Reformation Lutheran, also your partner. Watching how that has been mutually beneficial to both congregations is a really, really beautiful thing. The folks from Reformation will go out to Economwalk, and you can imagine that that's a bit of a journey, not only distance-wise, but just what community feels like to the people who live in those two places, right? But this partnership, they work really hard on acknowledging the reciprocity there. It is not a giver and receiver kind of relationship. And that's probably the most important thing to talk about in this kind of partnership. And the best analogy I know of, I'm going to ask you to think of somebody who might be like this in your life. Best analogy I know of is, did you have or do you currently have somebody who you would consider kind of like an extra member of the family to whom you are not related by blood or marriage? Did you have that growing up, or do you have that now? Was there kind of that extra uncle who actually wasn't your uncle? Or I saw a few nods around the room. If you nodded and you're willing to share, who is that person?
Father of my best buddy in high school.
Okay, so the father of your best friend in high school, kind of like a bonus father for you? I love it. Go ahead.
My husband's best friend growing up is now, he's uncle and his wife is the aunt, and it's another aunt and uncle for our kids. Their kids are older, so their cousins that are a little bit older can help out. Our kids can look up to.
Right, right. Yeah. We had, I know in my house growing up, Thanksgiving dinner was always fascinating because you didn't know who was necessarily going to be around the table. There would be family friends who had kind of become like family. I have I guess you'd call him my stepbrother, maybe? He was, see if you can trace this, my mother and his father-in-law were married, right? So my mom married, after she and my father got divorced, I had a stepdad. That stepdad had 2 daughters. One of the daughters married a guy named Mike. Well, the daughter and Mike got divorced and my stepfather died, right? So now on paper, there is no connection from me to Mike. Mike has been in and out of jail multiple times. My mother, who still has no technical connection to Mike, except it is her late husband's former son-in-law. My mother was the one to go pick him up when he served his last day and was getting out of jail and needed somebody to come pick him up. They are now neighbors, and my mom is like a bonus grandma for his little one. In that kind of a relationship, it doesn't look like this, right? Even if Mike needs something and my family has something to help, there are also times where Mike has something that really blesses us. My mom spends half the year in Canada. She's a snowbird. I told you I'm from Arizona, right? So she spends half the year in Canada. Guess who takes care of her house while she's out of town? Mike, because he's right next door. When the water pipe burst in the wall and there was damage, Mike came over and took care of it. So that's what accompaniment looks like. That's the big fancy word, right, for it. That's what accompaniment looks like, as we recognize we both have something to offer. And I have been profoundly touched by, that's my favorite part of working in the Synod office, is getting to see these moments of accompaniment. So, Pastor Ann, I didn't warn you about this, I'm gonna call on you really quick. I am simply curious if you'd be able to share what the last, are there memories from your time on staff here of an event with Cross or Reformation, or what were some of the last things that happened with either of those congregations that you remember? And thanks for being a good sport, because I didn't warn you I was going to do this.
One of the ways that we partner with Reformation is with our youth. So every year, youth from Reformation go on the mission trip. And that's just a really beautiful thing to see. And then they also their kids will come to Vacation Bible School here at St. Matthew's as well, but not just as participants, as helpers, right?
That's great.
So that's probably the most recent one.
Okay.
Cross, before the pandemic, do you all remember Tom Guide, Sweet Tom Guide? He was the person that ordered food for when it was our turn to host lunch at Cross for their Wednesday lunch, and Larry Juris was a big helper in that as well. And there is no more Wednesday lunch at Cross. That went away with COVID and with the pandemic. So that was a really vibrant way for people at St. Matthew's to be involved at Cross and vice versa. And it's kind of gone now. Tom Guide died, right? And they don't do that lunch anymore.
Right.
So with Cross, it's been a while since we've had those kind of regular relational moments with them, because the way that we were plugged into their church is not happening anymore.
Right.
So that's a place where we need to find some new ways to partner.
Right. Okay. Please.
Yeah, I was one of the people that did that for 10 years, And what breaks my heart now is Larry is in full-blown Alzheimer's. He doesn't recognize me or anyone else anymore. But he served in the kitchen. He did the cooking, and Don Raltz and I were dessert chefs, and there were 7 people on the line that served the meals. And we did that for 10 years. And I told Holly that I feel so terrible that Larry was such a good man and served his God the way he did,
Yeah.
that he has to suffer this way, but his God will take him when it's time.
Yeah, yeah, Alzheimer's is a terrible disease.
And there's,
Yeah.
while we're not partners with Mount Zion Lutheran Church, they have a program called TOSA Cares.
Yeah,
And we they get boxes from some company, and we box food for 1 month for families. Actually, every 3 weeks, we get together on a Friday and box food up. There's other groups that get together on Wednesday, so we'll have maybe 40 different sized meals for people that come in. And the people that I see there from, not from Mount Zion, they're from all different churches all over the city. But they've answered the call to, as Jesus said, what you do for the least of my brothers, you do for me. So that's the way I take it, you know. There's nothing I can do to thank him for what he's done, but he's given me a commission. You look after other people.
yeah. Yeah. And that is, I mean, those are beautiful stories of what partnership can look like at all sorts of different places on the spectrum, right? Essentially, that's why I started with this story about my church in Fargo, is that, each of us could just be individual Christians in our house, but instead we choose to come together as a community and have this partnership that you call St. Matthew's Lutheran Church.
And JOMM started in the basement of this church.
Right, oh yeah.
And
Just one more.
Dave and I, we were one of the first ones. We would take big pans of food to Hephatha, and Pastor Mary Margaret was so grateful that, and look where it is now. When you do the right thing, that they've got a warehouse, and
Right.
they bring in pallets of frozen chicken nuggets or frozen bratwurst or other foods, and he's got a complete staff, because now he's got a Siebert grant
Oh, absolutely, it's
for
growing.
$250,000, so he can hire inner city people to help package. We did that until COVID came along,
Right, yeah.
and I would pick up Larry Jers too and take him, and that was another thing that Larry did.
Yeah.
So,
So these are, I think, I really appreciate you naming that, because this congregation has had a long history of partnerships all across this spectrum, right? And so, like, if we kind of picture, temporary touch and base, supporting each other organizationally on this end, and, like the congregations that really form a tight partnership on this end, where it's really relationally based, there are things that happen all along this spectrum. And I would say, there's a difference. I've worked with several churches, and there is a difference, and please hear me clearly, it is not a positive or negative difference, it just is a different sort of partnership, right? When there is a food line and you are handing food to people, that is one form of partnership. When it's family style and everybody, maybe you brought the food, but you're gonna do it family style and you are interspersed sitting at the tables with people, eating with them and building those relationships, that's probably a little bit more toward this end of the spectrum, right? Where we're actually sitting down and building relationships. And I would say that's part of what would differentiate the things on that spectrum, is that over here it's kind of a casual, we're aware of each other kind of relationship. And over here it is walking into the room and going, hey, how's your mom? The last time we were together you said she was sick. That's on this end of the spectrum. And those relationships, when you invest in that kind of a partnership, those relationships are mutually beneficial in a way that really equalizes the playing field, right? We each bring what we can bring, but but we are both blessed by the encounter. And that's one of the things I see in Outreach for Hope at the bike ride, is that people are touching base with each other, and the relationship becomes more important than the money. Relationship leads, and financial support, food support, whatever else follows. I think that is probably, if there's one thing to take away from this today, it is as you move on that spectrum of partnership, you move more toward relationship leading the way, and then the other forms of support in both directions following the relationship. Did you have a question or a thought?
Just quickly, and years ago, we did that with Reformation, so this end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
We had potlucks, and we
Right.
went down there, and this many years ago, and you would come in with your dish, and you would sit at a table with people you didn't know, or with, we sat together. You know, it was family style, and it was a totally different experience than, because I've also been to Cross, totally different experience, and I appreciate that you're making that distinction and not saying that one is necessarily better than the other, because this needs to exist, but this was really cool.
Right.
You know, that togetherness, yeah.
Well, and this needs to exist because there are people who are dealing with material poverty.
Mhm.
But we just have to be really clear and open-eyed about the things that happen in that kind of an encounter, where we can unintentionally start to define people by what they lack. But relationships take care of that, right? So that is one of the things that I work with churches a lot on in this role, is trying to get to know their neighbors in a way that doesn't define them by what they lack. So kind of the typical church question, and it's not a bad question, but there are better questions, there are deeper questions. But the typical question we ask is, what do our neighbors need, and how can we help? Well, that's born of wonderful intentions, and a lot of good has been done in the world by seeking to answer that question. And it's sometimes not as relationally transforming as when you meet people and you're on the same level, where you're seeing the relational beauty emerge between the two of you. So yeah, some of these things absolutely need to happen, and I think then it's just about having clarity, and it's not better or worse, but it is deeper. This end is a little bit like swimming in the deep end of the pool. It takes a little bit more risk, but it's infinitely more rewarding when you have those relationships with people, right? And I've seen that with Reformation in particular. A couple of their partnerships, and their historic partnership with St. Matthew's is important. I've worked a lot with Reformation in this role, and they are an example of a partnership church, kind of like Hephatha is as well. Pastor Mary Martha is still the pastor at Hephatha Lutheran, and she will often describe Hephatha as a mosaic or a quilt, where every partner and every member and everybody else has a square in the quilt, and that's the only way it is a whole. And really, Reformation is very similar. Yeah, go ahead, Pastor Ann.
I think it's important also to acknowledge that, like, that spectrum, right? At one point in history, it could have been over here,
Mhm.
right? And maybe because of any number of circumstances, it comes over here.
Right.
But you can deepen that relationship again, right? Like just like you can with an old friend that you haven't seen for a while.
Exactly.
But part of the way to do that is to acknowledge that you haven't seen your friend in a while.
Right.
Right? And to have the conversations or to do the work to enliven that relationship.
Right. And sometimes, and I think that's part of why I hope one of the greatest takeaways from this today is that idea of a spectrum, and just being clear where we're at, and acknowledging that some of our connections with other congregations are gonna be over here, and that's okay, so that we have the energy to invest in a couple over here, right? Like, for a lot of years, Mike and I lost touch, this former step-brother-in-law kind of, right? But acknowledging that and saying that we've kind of moved back over here, I think this is a really important point that Pastor Ann's bringing up. To just say, nope, you know what? I want to make an intentional decision right now in my life. And there might be some other things that I need to say no to do it. But I want to make an intentional decision to reinvest in that relationship. Text them occasionally. How you doing? What can I keep in my prayers for you? Something that feels mutual and not like a handout. That then leads me back over here, but this takes energy and vulnerability. We have to be open with each other. And that, when, just like in the best relationships in our lives, it's really hard to get close to somebody if you're not willing to kind of open your heart to them and be real with them, right? Some of you in the room are married. If you're constantly hiding a part of yourself from your spouse, that is going to keep the relationship from being deep like it can be when you know each other very, very well, and they know all of your worst things that you don't really like about yourself, and they still look at you and say, you are worthy of love. And so when we can be real and open with people, that's one of the ways that Reformation's actually been a tremendous blessing to many people in their partnerships, is that by building that partnership across what are often racial lines, economic, daily reality lines, we start to see each other not as stories, but as people, not as headlines, nothing else. And so like the relationship here with Reformation, at various points, it's moved along that spectrum. One of the most beautiful, how about one more little story? Hephatha's partnership with Our Saviors in West Bend. Okay, two very different communities, but they invest in that partnership and they both go both directions. So members of Our Saviors in West Bend will come and just worship, not just give things. Relationship leads and all the other material things follow, right? Once a year, they do this really cool thing where the summer youth program kids who do a bunch of the work around Hephatha during the summer get to go out to Blue Lotus Retreat Center, which is out in West Bend, and they go with members from Our Saviors. There's a big pond there where you can go out on a little boat, you can go fishing, you can spend the day swimming. So the kids from Hephatha then get a chance to just have this relaxing, beautiful day at Blue Lotus Retreat Center. And watching people interact, some of the members of Our Saviors have watched these kids grow up, right? And so they're like all these bonus grandmas and grandpas, aunts and uncles. What a blessing that is in a world that teaches us we're supposed to be divided. Because if I were to set before you one of the young people who's helping lead at Hephatha and one of the older people from Our Saviors in West Bend and say, do you think these two are in a relationship? You'd probably go, probably not. And indeed they are. And they are both blessed by it because then they can't see each other as stories or headlines anymore. They see each other as people. So, please.
I used to belong to Good Shepherd Lutheran Church at 48th and Nash.
Yes.
And we had a good connection with Hephatha. We'd take our choir and congregation down there and worship together for Thanksgiving or other events.
Yeah.
And they would come out and worship with us. And it was a great relationship. Also, the women's group collected diapers and formula and clothes for babies and brought to Hephatha's baby sanctuary. And it created a lot of good relationships.
Right. And think about how that mirrors the passage we started with today. How different it is, like, because without the relationships, you could have just collected diapers and dropped them off.
Yeah.
And that takes less vulnerability, that takes less of an investment from us. We just need to put a box out and announce it for a couple weeks, and then one person goes and drops off the diapers and off we go. But when there's relationships, it looks a lot more like Ruth and Naomi, right? I mean, this end of the spectrum is saying, we're gonna cling to each other in a certain way and be blessed by that. Where you go, I will go. That is this end of the spectrum, and it's richly blessing. And yet, it takes the investment of time. So sometimes I think it's just acknowledging where we're at on the spectrum with different partnerships, and knowing that the deeper we go on this end, the more we're going to be, I think, surprised and blessed by God's grace. I do know that. Pastor Ann, let me just touch base with you and see, like, what's stirring for you as we have this conversation? Is there one more place that you're hoping we might go?
I'd be interested in kind of taking a survey to see where people think our partnerships are on that spectrum.
Yeah, right.
And yeah, that's, I think, would be a place to go.
Yeah,
Sure.
that's great. That'd be helpful. And again, remembering that this is not a bad to good spectrum. It's kind of like the swimming pool analogy. It's just a shallow to deep spectrum, right? Like, this is kind of us dipping our toes in the water, and this is us diving into the deep end, right? Neither are bad on a hot day, but one will cool you off a little bit more, right? And one definitely is more richly blessed. So like the partnership in El Salvador, where would we kind of say, if this is a 1 and this is a 10, where would we kind of say we're at with the partnership? What's the name of the congregation?
Casa Esperanza.
Ah, Casa Esperanza, okay. Okay. So where would we say we're kind of at on that? Someone brave enough to throw out a number?
Well, remind us what 1 and 10 mean in terms of
Well, so-
relationship and accompaniment.
Yeah, it's kind of we know of each other to we know each other. Shallow end to the deep end, right?
I feel like for that one, it varies so much depending on which member of our congregation we're talking about. Because there are people who have gone to El Salvador and continue to do that, and those
Yeah,
people have
they're
a
over here.
truly deep relationship.
Yeah.
But the rest of the congregation is pretty far away from that.
Right.
So then figuring out where as a congregation we'd be, I feel, is a little harder.
Right.
Because I feel like it's more of depending on whether that's a partnership you've decided as an individual or as a small group to really focus in on.
Right. Well, and I think too, it's gonna, I'm really nailing this home, but I'm doing so on purpose. It isn't bad and good, right?
Mhm.
It is simply, where are we gonna invest the time and energy right now? So it's not bad if that's kind of over here at like a 2 or a 3, because there are some people who are deeply connected, but in terms of the whole congregation, like if we were to go out with a microphone on Sunday morning and say, tell us what you know about our partners in El Salvador, would most people say, I'm not sure, right? And that's not a bad thing, it's just good to be aware of it, right? And then, as a congregation, we can make the decisions, which couple of these do we want to invest time and energy in moving to a deeper place of relationship? And acknowledging what Pastor Ann brought up before about how it does change seasonally in our life, and that's okay, absolutely. So it sounds like maybe the El Salvador thing is kind of a little bit like there are some people who have really deep partnerships. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say maybe a 5.
Maybe a 5? Okay. Is there information sharing? Because that's one thing, right? Kind of over here is like, are there things in your newsletter about what's happening with them? Do they know anything that's happening with you? These are just good questions to ask, right? And not, let me just say this really clearly, I believe that guilt and shame are like shackles. And so if we feel ashamed of something, like, oh, we should be better, goodness, don't use the word should. Let's just be clear about what it is, so that we can then make clear decisions about where we want to invest our time and energy, right?
Well, I know, like you're saying, awareness is a big part of it, and
Right.
we, not everyone can go to El Salvador,
Right.
but if you're aware of what is being done with our partners in El Salvador, then it becomes easier to know, well, how can I help? Whether it's giving things, or maybe I will go to El Salvador this time. We have in the past had people from both El Salvador and Tanzania come here, which just makes it more obvious to everyone who's here what's going on with those partnerships.
Right.
And time and money and circumstances mean we can't do that all the time.
Right.
But reaching out like that, I think is really helpful.
But I love that. Like, what would it look like if we invested the same amount of time and money in making sure they had the chance to come here as we do that we have the chance to go there? Like, that's what moves that to a deeper level of relationship, is when we start really trying to pay attention to equity in those relationships. Because it would be really weird for me to like meet the neighbors in my neighborhood by saying, hi, my name's Matt, I'm your neighbor, what does your family need and how can I fix it? That's a weird way to be a neighbor, right? And yet sometimes we unintentionally do this with other partners, right? So yeah, gosh, if there was an effort to bring folks here and do a lot of listening. One of the lines that we use all the time in our congregational renewal work is, for most people, feeling heard is so close to feeling loved that the two are indistinguishable. A couple of you have heard me say that ad nauseum. Kind of tired of it probably. But if we can help people feel heard, we can help them feel loved, right? Yeah. Okay. How about the Tanzania partnership? What's the name of that?
Singisi.
The Gisi. And I know that this is really, really important to individuals, right? How about as a congregation? Like, are you aware of what's going on in their congregation? Are they aware of anything that's happening here? Where would you say, if you had to 1 to 10, give that a ballpark number?
Several years ago, we invested in 22 milk cows. Now, it doesn't sound like much to people in the United States.
Right,
but to the family there, they have fresh milk from the cow. The milkman comes around and they sell the milk to the milkman, so the cow is earning them a salary.
That's huge.
And when Pastor Chris, and I'll never forget this, the whole village showed up at the airport. And they carried him on their shoulders. They were so thankful. Just for a simple thing, it's amazing how, if you do something, it sounds, it's kind of simple to us,
right.
But to people in need, a small thing can mean a whole lot.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And I know another thing that I like about St. Matthew's. Every other Sunday they make 100 bag lunches for repairers of the breach.
Oh, that's great.
Homeless shelter.
Right.
And I saw Carl walk in. He will sequester several of us to help him serve meals at the guest house. And we have, I think we do about 30, 35 people showed up for dinner.
Right.
Homeless people.
Right.
And it's just giving up a little bit of your time, but you're doing something meaningful to them.
Oh, absolutely. And it's, it sounds like St. Matthew's has a ton of really cool things that exist on this end of the spectrum in terms of like, resources, food, things like that. What a great thing that is. And just like friendships, I know a ton of people, but there's only a handful that I have the time and energy to really invest in this kind of relationship with. And I think that spectrum is part of what we're talking about. You all have a ton of beautiful things over here. And it's not to say that they are less than because they haven't moved over here. It is just to say which things do we want to move over here. So go ahead, and then we'll kind of wrap up so I'm not keeping you too long.
Well, Joan and I went to Tanzania, just the two of us on our own.
Yeah.
But what made me feel very awkward is they treated us like we were gods, and I kept thinking, even at the Meru Diocese, we acknowledge the funds you give, this, and this. And I thought to myself, it made me think of when you have your estate plan, you don't want to tell your kids how much money you got because they'll treat you differently. But the good thing I saw was the coffee project, where it's a product here we really want and appreciate. It becomes more of a two-way thing when you look at real practicality.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they have such a great need. I mean, it's amazing for what little you can give them, so much they can do. But they also know we better be nice to them guys. They ain't going to send the money.
Well,
and that's what worries me.
No, you're naming a really important dynamic, and I think part of what we can probably do is really try to cultivate our own gratitude as well.
My mistake is I should have their emails and we should talk back and forth.
Right. That would be another step on this. So I'd be curious about that. Like, how do we cultivate our own gratitude so that if some folks from Tanzania would show up, we would want to all show up at the airport and carry them on our shoulders because we know that we are richly blessed by this relationship, right? Okay, really? Go ahead, and then we're going to...
I was just going to say,
Yeah.
I think part of it is they're so far away.
Right.
And then COVID happened.
Yeah.
And so that really interrupted, I think, our partnerships internationally.
Yeah.
And the good news is that there's a trip planned for El Salvador again. So maybe that's the first step in moving towards a more relational
Yeah,
partnership.
absolutely. And then just remember how awkward that would be to meet your neighbors and say, what do you need and how can I fix it?
Right.
Yes, that can come later, but if it's led by relationship, led by listening, right? Okay, really quick, how about the cross partnership? 1 to 10, what would you say? Ballpark.
Well, we still do send products down there.
For sure. I'm curious about, like, where do we think, so sending products and stuff, that's great, and it's on this end, right?
Maybe
Okay.
1 to 3.
Maybe 3, 4, something like that. And again, no shame in that. Let's just be clear and open and honest about it, right? That there are all sorts of situations. The meal stopped, and COVID happened, and all of this. Okay, how about Reformation?
I feel like that's probably the deepest relationship that we have as a church between our partnerships. I mean, when they came to Lenten service, it was amazing. They just bring this, they bring this vibrancy and this life, and it's wonderful. So
Right.
I would say that's one that I think is higher as a.
Right?
I would agree, except I've always said we don't go there.
Ah,
They
Yeah.
come here.
They come here.
We never go there.
ooh, so that would be a
That's
great
true.
open conversation. No, it's my fault for going long, Pastor Ann. I do, it's 10:46. I'm starting to wear out my welcome. That's right. Yeah, Brenda's like, that's right. Go ahead, please, I saw your
We
hand.
do go to Reformation, not for church.
Yeah.
We go, they have a baby fair.
Oh, yeah.
Well, yeah, we do.
That's
that.
great.
They
Yeah,
have,
that's
um,
right. That's right.
Other,
Yeah.
and we go there to help drive kids to various places.
Yeah, oh, which is great.
Right, so,
I was thinking of cross,
Oh, okay.
more than.
Oh, yeah.
Cross more than Reformation.
Cross more than
Because-
Reformation, yeah.
Yeah, because Pastor Matt preached there a couple times.
Right,
And we
right.
didn't go. I went once, but
Right.
no one else was there.
So wouldn't it be interesting, we'll just use this as a very quick thought experiment at the end here. What would that look like to have a small group of people who say once every however often, we're gonna go and worship at Reformation. And we're just gonna worship there instead of here that morning, and then we are going to listen while we're there. Maybe it's prayer requests could be shared between the two congregations, something, and then when you come back here, make sure to find a creative way to share your experiences with the other members of St. Matthew's. Like, here's what we experienced when we worshiped there. Yeah.
Reformation also has Blessing Sunday coming up,
Mhm.
where they have invited all the partner congregations to go. And I'm not sure, I can't remember which Sunday it's coming up.
Yeah. I know that for me, it always feels like holy ground when I set foot at Reformation. This little storefront, but people who can absolutely name for you what God is doing in their lives, right? Okay, to avoid the awkwardness of people feeling like they have to slip out, I need to be a good facilitator and end it. But thank you very much for coming and just chatting through this. I hope the greatest takeaway is that spectrum piece. Thank you for everything you do.
I misspoke.
If you ever get the chance to meet